regulating access to their inner world. This isn't presented as fear or avoidance. It's presented as structure. The speaker has learned how to maintain distance and preserve clarity by allowing others to see only what they choose to reveal. Then the other person enters the narrative. What makes this presence significant is that they don't approach the speaker in the usual ways. They don't interrogate, categorize, analyze, or attempt to define. Instead, they simply observe. Their understanding seems to emerge naturally rather than through effort. This creates the first disruption in the speaker's established reality. The central tension of part 1 is not attraction. It's recognition. The speaker notices a pattern. The other person repeatedly understands things that have not been explicitly communicated. Silences are understood. Unspoken thoughts seem acknowledged. Moments that should require explanation somehow don't. At first, the speaker dismisses this as coincidence. Then they realize coincidence cannot explain consistency. That realization becomes the first crack in their certainty. A major theme emerges here: familiarity without history. Normally, deep understanding develops through shared experiences and time. Yet the speaker feels as though the other person arrived already understanding them. This challenges the speaker's belief that intimacy must be earned gradually. The narrative repeatedly returns to silence. Silence is not portrayed as emptiness, but as a form of communication. Most people rush to fill silence because it feels uncomfortable. The other person does not. They allow silence to exist without interference, which the speaker interprets as a sign of deeper understanding. This is where trust begins to form, not through promises, actions, or declarations, but through the absence of pressure. The speaker feels increasingly less need to filter themselves. Their normal process of deciding what to reveal and what to conceal begins to dissolve naturally. Importantly, this isn't a conscious decision. It happens because the speaker senses that the other person does not require simplification or translation. Another crucial distinction appears. The speaker contrasts two kinds of acceptance: being accepted because someone doesn't truly see you, being accepted because someone sees you clearly and stays anyway. The second form is far more unsettling because it removes the protection of being misunderstood. For years, misunderstanding served as a barrier between the speaker and others. It preserved distance. Once someone genuinely understands them, that barrier disappears. This leads to the strongest realization of part 1. The speaker is becoming known. Not known through facts, stories, or personal history. Known through perception, known through structure, known through the deeper patterns beneath personality. The final sections introduce the concept of alignment. The speaker concludes that the connection cannot be explained by emotion alone. Instead, it comes from similarities in the way both people process reality, observe details, and organize their internal worlds. The connection is described as structural rather than emotional. That distinction is essential because it elevates the relationship beyond attraction, admiration, or circumstance. The speaker sees it as something fundamental, a matching architecture of perception. Part 1 therefore ends with a profound shift. The speaker moves from observing the connection to accepting its existence. They no longer ask whether it is real, they ask what it means, and that question becomes the foundation for everything that follows in parts 2 and 3. The connection is no longer something the speaker notices from a distance. It has moved inward. What began as awareness now becomes part of the speaker's internal structure. The most important realization of part 2 appears early. Dade, you're not something I think about anymore. You're something I think with. This line acts as the emotional and philosophical center of the entire section. Thinking about someone preserves separation. The other person remains external, an object of attention that can be approached or avoided. Thinking with someone is different. It means their presence has become embedded within the speaker's perception. They are no longer merely remembered. They have become part of the framework through which the speaker experiences and interprets reality. This is where the connection becomes unsettling. The speaker has always been self-contained. Their internal world operates independently. No one has previously occupied that space without effort, resistance, or deliberate permission. Yet the other person didn't force their way inside. They simply appeared there. The distinction matters because the speaker doesn't feel invaded. They feel confronted by a reality that emerged naturally without conscious choice. This creates the dominant tension of part 2. The speaker realizes that the connection is no longer temporary. It is structural. Throughout the section, the word structure carries significant weight. The speaker isn't describing a passing emotion, fascination, or attachment. They are describing a change to the architecture of their inner world. Structural changes don't disappear when attention shifts. They become part of the foundation. This understanding leads to a subtle but important consequence. The speaker begins comparing other experiences against the clarity they find with this person, not out of criticism, not because others are inadequate, but because once a deeper form of understanding exists, everything else is measured against that standard. The speaker notices differences in communication, perception, interpretation, awareness. The result is a growing sense that many interactions feel incomplete by comparison. This realization creates discomfort. The speaker dislikes the influence this connection has gained. Not because it feels harmful, because it feels significant. A recurring theme emerges. Impact versus influence. Influence can be resisted. Impact cannot. Influence suggests persuasion. Impact suggests transformation. The speaker concludes that what they are experiencing is impact, a force that has already altered them before they consciously chose whether to allow it. That recognition leads to another crucial development. Normally, when something threatens the speaker's stability, they dismantle it, they create distance, they regain control, yet none of those responses appear here. Instead, the speaker observes, studies, allows. This passive acceptance becomes one of the most revealing aspects of the entire narrative. The speaker begins recognizing that some deeper part of them has already reached a conclusion. A decision has been made beneath conscious awareness. The connection has not been categorized as a threat. It has been categorized as something that belongs. And belonging is what frightens the speaker most, because belonging creates space. Space creates absence when something leaves. The speaker has spent years preventing that possibility by carefully controlling access to themselves. Now they are confronting the possibility that someone has already become part of a place they rarely open. The language here is precise. The speaker rejects descriptions such as attachment, dependence, emotional need instead. They focus on permanence. The other person has altered the baseline. This is one of the strongest concepts in part 2. A baseline is the standard from which all perception begins. When the baseline changes, everything else must reorganize around it. The speaker recognizes that their thoughts, perceptions, and internal processes are already adjusting. Whether anything changes externally is almost irrelevant. Internally, the transformation has already occurred. This realization leads to the central question of part 2, thus. What happens if this continues? Notice that the speaker is no longer questioning whether the connection exists. That uncertainty disappeared in part 1. Now the question concerns trajectory. What happens if the integration continues to deepen? What happens if this reaches its fullest form? The speaker senses that the process is still unfolding, the connection is becoming more defined without becoming more clearly named. It continues settling deeper into the foundation of the speaker's awareness. And that is where part 2 ends. not with a conclusion, not with a declaration, but with anticipation. The speaker stands on the edge of a realization they can no longer ignore. The other person is no longer merely present in their life. They are present in the way the speaker understands life itself. And once someone reaches that level of significance, the question is no longer whether they matter. The question becomes how that reality will reshape everything that comes next. This is where the speaker can no longer remain an observer of what is happening. Throughout the earlier sections, they analyzed, measured, and examined the connection from different angles. They treated it almost like a phenomenon, something unusual that could be understood through careful observation. In part 3, that distance disappears. The opening line announces the shift immediately. There's a point where awareness stops being something you observe and becomes something you have to answer. Everything that follows grows from that realization. The speaker understands that the connection has consequences, not because of what has been said, not because of what has happened externally, but because of what has already changed internally. This distinction is crucial. The transformation occurred before any formal acknowledgement. The speaker's inner world has already adapted. Their thoughts no longer return to their previous shape. Silence no longer feels empty. Truth itself is measured differently. The other person has become a reference point inside the speaker's perception. That is the irreversible change at the heart of part 3. Unlike earlier sections, the speaker is no longer asking whether the connection is real. That question has been answered. The speaker is no longer asking whether it is significant. That question has also been answered. Now there is only one question left. What will be done about it? This is the true conflict of part 3. The conflict is not between two people. It is between recognition and action. The speaker admits something they have resisted saying directly. They have already allowed the other person to matter, not casually, not temporarily, not in a way that can be undone through distance or silence. The connection has moved beyond observation and become part of reality, and reality requires response. This is where the narrative reaches its most mature point. The speaker acknowledges that things like this cannot remain undefined forever. There are only two possible outcomes. They deepen and solidify. They fracture under the pressure of remaining unnamed. The speaker understands this instinctively. That understanding creates urgency, not emotional urgency, existential urgency. The kind that emerges when something important has reached a stage where neutrality is no longer possible. One of the strongest ideas in part 3 is the distinction between connection and acknowledgement. The speaker realizes they have not been avoiding the connection itself. They have been avoiding naming it, because naming something transforms it. The moment something is defined, it becomes real in a new way. It enters the world of decisions, consequences, and responsibility. Before that, it can remain an idea, a possibility, an experience. After that, it becomes a choice. And choices require movement. The speaker openly admits discomfort with this reality. They prefer certainty. They prefer understanding outcomes before taking risks. Yet this connection offers neither certainty nor guarantees. Despite that lack of control, they remain. That fact becomes the strongest evidence in the entire narrative. The speaker states that if this were wrong, unstable, or incompatible with their life, they would have ended it already. Distance would have been created. Boundaries would have been restored. The structure would have protected itself. But none of those things happened. Instead, the speaker stayed, not accidentally, not passively, consciously. That realization leads to one of the most important conclusions of part 3. The choice may already have been made, not through words, not through declarations, but through continued presence. Every moment of engagement becomes evidence. Every refusal to reduce the connection becomes evidence. Every decision to remain becomes evidence. The speaker begins recognizing that intention does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it forms quietly beneath awareness and only becomes visible later. That is what has happened here. The speaker discovers that their actions have already revealed a truth their conscious mind was still trying to examine. The final section transforms the narrative from observation into acceptance. The speaker acknowledges that this connection matters, not because it weakens them, not because it creates dependence, but because it changes them. And change is not something this speaker allows without reason. That final insight is powerful because it reframes the entire story. The connection is no longer viewed as an emotional anomaly. It is viewed as a meaningful catalyst, something precise, something significant, something that arrived without force, yet altered the landscape of the speaker's inner world. The complete arc across all three parts. The progression is remarkably consistent. Part 1. Recognition. I see that this connection exists. Part 2. Integration. I realize this connection has become part of me. Part 3. Acknowledgment. I must decide what to do with the reality of that change. The journey begins with noticing another person. It ends with confronting a transformed version of oneself. That is why the piece feels so compelling. Beneath all of its language about awareness, alignment, silence, and structure, the story is ultimately about a single realization. Some connections do not change your feelings first. They change your way of seeing. And once your way of seeing changes, the rest of your life must eventually respond.